Please take a moment to find Leviticus chapter 16, if you have a Bible with you. Leviticus chapter 16. I know you were torn up not getting to do it last week, but here we are. It's late September, early October. Today is one of the most holy of days. A group of Hebrew slaves escaped from their Egyptian slave lords only a few months ago, and now they're wandering through the wilderness in an area called the Sinai Peninsula in the northeast corner of Egypt. And today is the focal point of their whole calendar. Everything else revolves around this day. It's a holiday, in Hebrew, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Nobody ate anything since last night. People have been fasting. The whole community has been fasting together. The high priest hardly slept last night. On one hand, feeling something like a child on Christmas Eve waiting for sleigh bells on the roof, and on the other hand, feeling something like a condemned man, dreading and fearing what's happening in the morning. But day breaks and people begin to make their way toward the tabernacle. The tabernacle was God's house. It was His tent pitched there in the middle of the community. And the tabernacle on the outside in the courtyard had a giant altar where sacrifices would have been made. There was a giant bronze bowl filled with water for ceremonial washing. The tabernacle itself consisted of two rooms. In the first room was another altar for burning incense. There was also a table with ceremonial bread on it and a golden lampstand called a menorah. In the second room, called the inner sanctuary, was the most holy place in all of Israel. In the inner sanctuary was the Ark of the Covenant. And just above the Ark of the Covenant was hovering the very Spirit of God. What the Jews called the Shekinah glory of God was present there in the inner sanctuary. Now people begin to make their way in the morning toward the outer courtyard, and they begin to collect and sort of congregate outside, watching and waiting in eager anticipation of what is going to happen today. Leviticus chapter 16 outlines for us, it narrates for us how everything is going to go down today. If you haven't been here, we've been going through the book of Leviticus. We've been inching our way through, crawling our way through. If you haven't been here for all of it, or if you haven't been here for any of it, then don't fret. You can still get something valuable out of today. Leviticus 16 is regarded as the center of the book of Leviticus. It's not, if you were to count up the verses, it's not the center, but it is the center theologically. There's balance of the book on one side and the other. It is the very epicenter of this book. And not only that, but Leviticus is at the center of the greater set of books called the Pentateuch, or the Law of Moses, which is the first 5 books of the Bible. And so Leviticus is in the center of the law, and in the center of that is the Day of Atonement. So the entire law revolves around this one sacred event. Hear now God's holy and authoritative word. Leviticus 16. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of Aaron's 2 sons, who died after they entered the Lord's presence and burned the wrong kind of fire before him. The Lord said to Moses, "Warn your brother Aaron not to enter the most holy place behind the inner curtain whenever he chooses. If he does, he will die. For the ark's cover, the place of atonement, is there, and I myself am present in the cloud above the atonement cover. When Aaron enters the sanctuary area, he must follow these instructions fully. He must bring a young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He must put on his linen tunic and the linen undergarments worn next to his body. He must tie the linen sash around his waist and put the linen turban on his head. These are sacred garments, so he must bathe himself in water before he puts them on. Aaron must take from the community of Israel 2 male goats for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. Aaron will present his own bull as a sin offering to purify himself and his family, making them right with the Lord. Then he must take the 2 male goats and present them to the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle. He is to cast sacred lots to determine which goat will be reserved as an offering to the Lord, and which will carry the sins of the people to the wilderness of Azazel. Aaron will then present as a sin offering the goat chosen by lot for the Lord. The other goat, the scapegoat chosen by lot to be sent away, will be kept alive, standing before the Lord. When it is sent away to Azazel in the wilderness, the people will be purified and made right with the Lord. The first 10 verses of this chapter serve as an outline for what the rest of the chapter is going to be about. So we go through Aaron getting dressed, and there are all these animals, and he kills some, and one of them gets to go free. And then in verse 11, we'll back up and begin to do the whole thing again in a bit more detail. But the whole thing begins with Aaron getting dressed. He has to bathe himself in this bronze bowl by taking some of the water out and just performing a ritual bath. And then he puts on these linen garments, a linen tunic, a linen undergarment, linen robe, and sash. And if you were just reading through Leviticus, you might get to that and think, okay, yeah, I get it, linen. Linen. Yeah, I see. Thanks. It's kind of repetitive. But actually, this is really important, because the high priest has his own set of garments that he would typically wear. There would be a chest piece that had jewels in it. There's a colorful ephod, which is kind of like a poncho. He would have a badge of holiness on his turban. There were bells around the bottom of his robe. But on this day, he takes all of that off, and he puts on the clothes of a regular, run-of-the-mill priest. It's an act of humility. He takes off the badge of holiness. He takes off the bells. He takes off the colors, and he comes in plain. Now, he begins with this first sacrifice in verse 11. Aaron will present his own bull as a sin offering to purify himself and his family, making them right with the Lord. After he has slaughtered the bull as a sin offering, he will fill an incense burner with burning coals from the altar that stands before the Lord. Then he will take 2 handfuls of fragrant powdered incense and will carry the burner and the incense behind the inner curtain. There, in the Lord's presence, he will put the incense on the burning coals, so that a cloud of incense will rise over the ark's cover, the place of atonement that rests on the Ark of the Covenant. If he follows these instructions, he will not die. Then he must take some of the blood of the bull, dip his finger in it, and sprinkle it on the east side of the atonement cover. He must sprinkle blood 7 times with his finger in front of the atonement cover. So Aaron begins with a bull that's there for him and for his family. And he slaughters it, and he's going to offer it as a sin offering on the altar outside. A sin offering is one of 5 different kinds of offerings. And the purpose of it was to cleanse the worshiper of any kind of unintentional sin, whether I forgot to do something, or I didn't mean to do that, or I wasn't trying to do that, but I still sinned. It's there to purify the worshiper. It's used to purify women after childbirth. It's used to purify people from skin diseases. So perhaps it's better to understand it as a purification offering. The high priest brings this animal, slaughters it, and it purifies him. And then he goes into the tabernacle, into the first room with the altar, and he takes some of the coals from the altar outside and he puts them on the altar. We've seen this before with Nadab and Abihu in chapter 10. They did it wrong and they died. But Aaron sprinkles 2 handfuls of incense, frankincense, onto these coals, and it releases smoke. Such a dark, thick smoke. If you've ever burned frankincense, it produces a dark, thick smoke. So thick that it would fill the tabernacle so that he can't see anything. And then when he goes behind the inner curtain into the inner sanctuary, he won't be able to see the Shekinah glory of God, the presence of God hovering above the ark. Because if he sees God, he will die. So the incense is used as a sort of smoke screen to shield his eyes from seeing God. But after he's offered the incense, he takes some of the blood from this bull and he goes into the inner sanctuary and he sprinkles the blood onto the Ark of the Covenant. And then he comes out and there are 2 goats waiting for him. And we have to decide which goat is going to get which fate. One will live, one will die. And so they cast lots. Maybe they have a bingo roller. Maybe they have straws that they draw. They probably use the Urim and the Thummim, which were probably two stones used for making decisions. But in some way, they cast lots and they decide this one will die and this one will live. And tradition says that they would take a scarlet thread and they would tie it around the horn of the one chosen to die and around the foot of the one chosen to live. And Aaron takes the one that's chosen to die and he slaughters it as a second sacrifice. Verse 15. Then Aaron must slaughter the first goat as a sin offering for the people and carry its blood behind the inner curtain. There he will sprinkle the goat's blood over the atonement cover and in front of it, just as he did with the bull's blood. Through this process, he will purify the most holy place, and he will do the same for the entire tabernacle because of the defiling sin and rebellion of the Israelites. No one else is allowed to inside the tabernacle when Aaron enters it for the purification ceremony in the most holy place. No one may enter until he comes out again after purifying himself, his family, and all the congregation of Israel, making them right with the Lord. So Aaron takes this first goat and he slaughters it, and it's going to be a sin sacrifice as well. And he takes the blood of this goat in a bowl and he goes into the most holy place again. Perhaps he has to refresh his smoke screen. But he goes into the most holy place, and again, he sloshes, splatters, sprinkles the blood with his finger onto the ark. Now, you might think that the reason that he's doing all of this is to purify the people. The text kind of sounds like that's what's happening. That through the slaughtering of these two animals, it purifies the priest and it purifies the people. But what the text says is that through this, he purifies the most holy place, and he purifies the tabernacle. You see, the tabernacle was used all year by people who were defiled by sin and rebellion and weakness and all kinds of problems. So the tabernacle receives this sort of residual impurity, and every year the tabernacle itself has to be purified because God cannot be present where there is impurity. And so every year they would purify it to create a space where God can be. Now, you notice that he does this again, not only in the most holy place and not only inside the tabernacle, but he does it to the altar as well. Verse 18. Then Aaron will come out to purify the altar that stands before the Lord. He will do this by taking some of the blood from the bull and the goat and putting it on each of the horns of the altar. Then he must sprinkle the blood with his finger 7 times over the altar. In this way he will cleanse it from Israel's defilement and make it holy. So the altar has received this residual impurity, and now he mixes the blood of the goat and the bull, and he puts some of it on each of the 4 horns of the altar, and he sprinkles it over the top of the altar 7 times. Why? Because he has to create a space where God can be present. He has to purify a space for God to be. So now we know what happens to the first goat. What happens with the second goat? Verse 20. When Aaron has finished purifying the most holy place and the tabernacle and the altar, he must present the live goat. He will lay both of his hands on the goat's head and confess over it all the wickedness, rebellion, and sins of the people of Israel. In this way, he will transfer the people's sins to the head of the goat. Then a man specially chosen for the task will drive the goat into the wilderness. As the goat goes into the wilderness, it will carry all the people's sins upon itself into a desolate land. So Aaron takes the second goat that has a scarlet thread tied around its foot, and he lays his hands on it, and he confesses the sin and the wickedness and the rebellion of the community. In this one instance, he transfers all of the guilt, all of the burden, all of the panic, all of the anxiety, all of the regret, all of the fear onto this one animal, and it is over. And with that, they send the animal into the wilderness, never to return. Some translations say that they send it into the wilderness to Azazel. Not all translations use the word Azazel, but some choose to translate it as a proper name. If that's the case, who is Azazel, or what is Azazel, or where is Azazel? Some believe it is a demon of the wilderness. So it stands as sort of a metaphor for sending sin back to where it came from. Perhaps this is to be understood simply as the go-away goat. Azazel may be related to Hebrew words that mean to go away. And so this is the goat that goes away and hopefully never returns. But one year, actually, the goat did return. When Israel had finally arrived in Israel and set up in Jerusalem and they had their temple, they offered this sacrifice and they sent this goat off into the wilderness. And a few days later, it came back to the city, which was kind of a bad omen. So they took it again to a mountaintop and they pushed it over a cliff to make sure that it never came back. And every year since then, they would lead the goat to a cliff to make sure that this goat would never return. But this goat bears the full weight of sin and rebellion, and it is banished. When this is all over, Aaron takes off these linen garments. He puts back on the bells and the badge of holiness and the ephod on the chest piece. And he offers two final sacrifices, a burnt offering for himself and a burnt offering for the people as a way of worshiping God. Now, one of the keys to understanding Leviticus is you have to realize Leviticus is all about Jesus. We've been saying this since the very beginning of this book. This book is all about Jesus. If you don't realize that, something is going to be drastically lost. When I was in Memphis a few weeks ago, I got to talking with one of my fellow students who's a preacher in Virginia, and I told him that we were going through Leviticus, and he said that Leviticus 16, this chapter, is his favorite chapter in the whole Bible. And I thought, there are some pretty great chapters in the Bible. Why this one? Why is this your favorite? And he said it's because of how clearly it points to Jesus. The first Christians saw very clearly that Jesus was the fulfillment of this whole ritual ceremony holiday. They realized that this was only a pattern, a premonition of greater things to come. It's only a shadow of the real thing, and the real thing is Jesus. One of the first people to articulate this really clearly was the writer of the book of Hebrews. Now, we don't know who wrote the book of Hebrews, but whoever they were, they saw in Jesus the fulfillment of this whole sacrificial system, and particularly Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So just listen as I read what the writer of Hebrews says. The priests regularly entered the first room as they performed their religious duties, but only the high priest ever entered the most holy place, and only once a year. And he always offered blood for his own sins and for the sins the people had committed in ignorance. By these regulations, the Holy Spirit revealed that the entrance to the most holy place was not freely open, as long as the tabernacle and the system it represented were still in use. This is an illustration pointing to the present time. For the gifts and sacrifices that the priests offer are not able to cleanse the consciences of the people who bring them. So Christ has now become the high priest over all the good things that have come. He has entered that greater, more perfect tabernacle in heaven, which was not made by human hands and is not part of this created world. With his own blood, not the blood of goats and calves, with his own blood, he entered the most holy place once for all time and secured our redemption forever. Under the old system, the blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a young cow could cleanse people's bodies from ceremonial impurity. Just think how much more the blood of Christ will purify our consciences from sinful deeds, so that we can worship the living God. For Christ did not enter into a holy place made with human hands, which was only a copy of the true one in heaven. He entered into heaven itself to appear now before God on our behalf. And he did not enter heaven to offer himself again and again like the high priest here on earth who enters the most holy place year after year with the blood of an animal. If that had been necessary, Christ would have had to die again and again ever since the world began. But now, once for all time, he has appeared at the end of the age to remove sin by his own death as a sacrifice. The old system under the law of Moses was only a shadow, a dim preview of the good things to come, not the good things themselves. The sacrifices under that system were repeated again and again, year after year, but they were never able to provide perfect cleansing for those who came to worship. If they could have provided perfect cleansing, the sacrifices would have stopped, for the worshipers would have been purified once for all time, and their feelings of guilt would have disappeared. But instead, those sacrifices actually reminded them of their sins year after year. For it is not possible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. And so, dear brothers and sisters, we can boldly enter heaven's most holy place because of the blood of Jesus. By his death, Jesus opened a new and life-giving way through the curtain into the most holy place. And since we have a great high priest who rules over God's house, let us go right into the presence of God with sincere hearts, fully trusting him. For our guilty consciences have been sprinkled with Christ's blood to make us clean, and our bodies have been washed with pure water. And then toward the end, the writer says, under the old system, the high priest brought the blood of animals into the holy place as a sacrifice for sin, and the bodies of the animals were burned outside the camp. So also Jesus suffered and died outside the city gates to make his people holy by means of his own blood. So let us go out to him outside the camp and bear the disgrace he bore. For this world is not our permanent home. We are looking forward to a home yet to come. Therefore, let us offer through Jesus a continual sacrifice of praise to God, proclaiming our allegiance to his name. The writer of Hebrews argues and explains that Jesus is everything that this system was trying to be. Everything that this system could not accomplish, Jesus did accomplish. Jesus, in a sense, when he dies, when he offers his own blood on the cross, he becomes both goats at the same time. The first goat was one that was sacrificed, it was slaughtered so that its blood could be sprinkled. And in the sprinkling of the blood, it created a place where God could be present among his people. And the writer of Hebrews says that the blood of Christ has been sprinkled on our consciences, purifying our inner being, creating a space where God can be present. Jesus, in his death, created a way for God to live in and among his people forever. The second goat was there as a scapegoat. It bore the full sin and responsibility and rebellion of everybody, and then it was sent away never to return. And obviously, in the same way, Jesus bore the sin and rebellion of all people, and that was banished, never to return. But the clear advantage of Jesus over the old system, what the writer of Hebrews points to again and again and again, the advantage that Jesus has over the old way of doing things is that Jesus only had to do it once. Under the old system, you had to return to the tabernacle year after year after year, and you had to offer more and more animals and more blood, and that what the blood was supposed to do in purifying the altar and the tabernacle, it never really got the job quite done. It was never able to provide perfect cleansing. But the writer says when Jesus offers his blood, he does provide perfect cleansing, and he only has to do it once. There was an old Devo song that we used to sing growing up. Can he still feel the nails every time I fail? Does he hear the crowd cry, crucify again? Am I causing him pain? Then I know I've got to change, because I just can't bear the thought of hurting him. And it's a sweet notion, and it's a catchy tune, and it's really emotional for like Friday night at camp. But the problem is the answer to all of those questions is no. He doesn't die over and over again. He dies once, and that covers it all. The clear advantage of Jesus over the Day of Atonement is that he only has to do it once. So may you confess your sins over this supreme scapegoat. May you send him away with the sins attached to him, that your sins might never return to you. May you be holy as he is holy.